Who's to blame for climate breakdown? The obvious people you'd point to would be the fossil fuel companies, but they couldn't operate without us broadly believing it was okay for them to do this, okay for them to destroy our life support systems. And who makes it okay for them? Who creates the impression that business as usual is fine? The media. The media has created the social license to operate of the fossil fuel companies and indeed all the major destructive forces of life on Earth. Over the past 20 or 30 years, there's been an onslaught in the billionaire press of people denying or downplaying climate breakdown.
I know you're a climate protester, so facts probably aren't your thing.
The planet is sick, but it's not from climate change. It's sick from some very lonely, media-inspired leftists who want to make your life as miserable and as useless as theirs.
AOC's Climate Change Con.
It never ceases to amaze me the tripe that the public is fed.
Hysterical and purposefully provocative language
to terrify our children.
Part of the hysteria, the idea of an apocalypse that's coming because of climate change, none of this is backed by the science that they talk about.
Alarmism and despair. Banish the Greta Thunbergs.
This whole global warming thing is a total fairy tale.
It's all an illusion. It's all been cooked up by communist climate scientists who are just trying to line their own pockets because, of course, we know if you want to become really rich, become a research scientist, and they're so much richer than oil executives, for example. Or they're saying, well, it might exist, but it's not that big a deal, and we don't want to cripple our economies. We can leave it for the future. And in doing so, they've given the fossil fuel companies their social license to operate. They've allowed this entire shitfest to happen. They've allowed climate breakdown to go ahead. It could not have happened without them. If they didn't put that massive effort into propaganda on behalf of business as usual, then business as usual would not have continued. We would have changed by now. And I see these people in the same light as people saw William Joyce, Lord Haw-Haw, the person who sided with the Nazis against British interests, siding with the forces which threaten the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced, the closure of the conditions that make human life and much of the rest of life on Earth possible. But shockingly, it's not confined to the billionaire press. If you look at the BBC, for example, for many years, every time they got a climate scientist on, they would get a climate denier on to say it's not happening.
The rate of warming, according to the data, is much slower than the models used by the IPCC.
And often the denier was from a so-called think tank, which in many cases were taking money from the fossil fuel companies but not acknowledging that. And if we tried to raise this question, if we said, actually, excuse me, who's funding you? We were accused of being conspiracy theorists. Then finally, in 2018, they published a document saying, yes, actually, maybe we have got this a little bit wrong. We shouldn't have a denier on every time we have a climate scientist on to both side this issue because actually the science is solid. And you might think, oh, well, that's progress. Until you discover that in 1982, Exxon, the giant oil company, produced an internal document saying that the science is solid and there are no valid grounds for disputing it. Of course, they then went ahead and disputed it and paid people millions of dollars to claim that it wasn't happening in the media. But they came to that conclusion 36 years before the BBC did, and they were an oil company. Has this finished? No, it hasn't. Because just recently, some of us discovered what the BBC has been teaching GCSE students. Climate breakdown has got some downsides, there's some bad stuff, but there are just as many positives, just as many upsides. For instance, if the ice melts, then we can start exploring new resources in Alaska and Siberia, such as oil. And it can open up new tourist resorts. And perhaps we could be healthier because we'd be outside more if the weather's warmer. And in their classic conflation of balance and impartiality, as if to prove that they can't tell the difference between those completely different concepts, they listed just as many positives as negatives. So any GCSE student learning from this BBC bite-sized module would look at it and say, yeah, well, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Yeah, on balance, maybe it's not such a bad thing. And yet this is the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced. This issue of false balance, it plagues the BBC. When there's a football result, when Italy beats England, they don't say, actually, we're going to bring someone into the studio saying that Italy didn't beat England and England actually won the match. That would be entirely consistent with the BBC's approach to balance. Now, there's a famous quote: if one person says it's raining and the other person says it's not, the journalist's job is not to strike a balance between those two people. It's to look out of the fucking window and see whether it's raining or not. Channel 4 was just as bad. It made one series called Against Nature and another massive programme called The Great Global Warming Swindle, both of which flatly denied the science and took pleasure in baiting scientists and environmentalists and basically shitting all over them.
We are told that the Earth's climate is changing. But the Earth's climate is always changing.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We have a vested interest in creating panic because then money will flow to climate science.
There's one thing you shouldn't say, and that is, this might not be a problem.
No study to date has positively attributed all or part of the observed climate changes to man-made causes.
They couldn't give a stuff about the impacts of what they were doing because they triggered a massive new wave of climate and ecological denial. As far as they were concerned, it was just bums on seats. They just wanted audience, and you get audience by creating a noise, by creating a great fuss. So again, that puts us in an impossible position. If you don't contest it, people think, oh, well, there you are, they must be right, you've got nothing to say. If you do contest it, you stoke the controversy, and that plays into their hands as well. And while you could fairly say that Channel 4 has considerably improved since those days, that was years and years in which we could have taken action, and they helped to prevent action from being taken. And I can talk from experience, the bitter experience of trying and trying to get these issues taken seriously by the broadcasters. In one case, after we'd put months of work into developing what I thought was a fantastic treatment, the producer took it to the controller of BBC Two at the time, and he looked at the title. That's all he saw, just the title. He said, "Is this environment?" And the producer said, "Yeah." He said, "I've been trying to get environment off this channel for the past 2 years. Why the fuck are you bringing me environment?" Another time, and again we spent months working on this treatment, a subsequent controller of BBC Two, she looks at it and said, "Monbiot, fuck off." And that was it, again, just gone, dismissed. These people are like emperors. They have these inordinate, enormous powers, and they systematically abuse those powers. And they prevented their audiences from hearing the reality of what was happening to life on Earth. They made these beautiful, glossy, blue-chip wildlife programs, but they made sure in those wildlife programs not to show what was happening to the wildlife. That only came much, much later, and after sustained lobbying by environmental groups. They gave false reassurance, just like the billionaire press has been giving false reassurance. Now, things have changed, they have improved, there's no doubt about that. But we lost those precious years, 30-odd years, in which we could have stopped this crisis. And now we're in emergency mode. We're desperately scrambling to try to prevent the destruction of our life support systems. And we have so little political support. We still have far too little media support. And a large part of the reason is this legacy of denial and delay and downplaying on the part of the media. So what do we do? Well, it's become crystal clear to me, and this is why I work with Double Down News, that we have to develop our own media and we have to create our own voices, because the established media are not going to do it. They're not going to step up. Even when they do slightly better than they've done in the past, they don't do nearly enough to draw attention to the scale and the consequences of the crisis that we face. And so we have to develop and work through our own ways of reaching people, our own ways of telling it, because they will not tell it as it is. They collaborate with the destruction of our lives, the destruction of much of life on Earth, and we can't afford to leave it to collaborators. I work with Double Down News because it bursts out of that tiny limited box which the media creates and allows us to see aspects of the world which we're not being shown by other broadcasters. So please support Double Down through Patreon and support the alternative we so desperately need.